It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Chris Carter, and we're going to be discussing his brand new book, The Case for the Afterlife, Evidence for Life After Death. Chris, it's truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Shaun.
Well, truly my pleasure. You're an author of 4 books. This newest one was my first jump into your material. I'm looking forward to going back and reading through your 3 previous books. But before we get into this new book today, I'd love to hear just a little bit of your background. So share a little bit of the Chris Carter origin story. Tell us, education. How did you find yourself working in this NDE space? Because this is, if you're not an experiencer, this is kind of a unique space to write and research as an author.
Right. Well, I suppose my journey into this topic started when I was a university student in England. One night, as I describe in my book, I was sitting around talking with one of my friends, and he was trying to urge me to join him and 2 other graduate students to spend our next year living on a farmhouse just outside of town owned by our college. And I wasn't sure. I was an expatriate student from Canada, and I wasn't sure if I really wanted to live that far outside of town in college. And but then he said something that caught my interest. He said, "The place is haunted." I said, "Well, has anybody seen anything?" And he said, "No, there's been a lot of strange sounds reported." So I hiked over there and visited the farmhouse. It was it was a picturesque stone 2-story house. And I stopped to speak in with the college carpenter who had his workshop on the property. And I just came straight out with it. I said, I hear the place is haunted. And he said, "Well, I don't know myself, but the carpenter before me, he swore the place was haunted." And so that was enough for me. I decided to move in. To make a long story short, I did see and hear some unusual things, which I could not readily explain. Nothing terribly dramatic, doors slamming. I heard a woman's voice once, which I couldn't account for, things like that. But it did spark my interest. And so when I returned back home to my own country, I wondered if any serious research had been done on these topics. So I went down to the local library, and I was surprised by the volume of research that had been done over the past 150 years. What really impressed me was some of the research done by the British and American Societies for Psychical Research. They were both founded in the 1880s, and their membership included some of the most prominent and highly regarded scientists, philosophers, lawyers, scholars on both sides of the Atlantic. And they'd gathered an enormous amount of research, which was documented in their 2 journals, the Journal of the British Society and the Journal of the American Society. And the evidence was so strong that by the early years of the 20th century, most of the original founding members who were still alive accepted the reality of our survival. And there was only one, even the ones that started out as diehard skeptics, they changed their minds, and they admitted it. There's only one that sat on the fence, and that was the philosopher William James. He was a philosopher at Harvard, as you may know. He was the first president of the American Society for Psychical Research. He's also fairly famous for his, he started the discipline of psychology, not parapsychology, psychology. And he always sort of sat on the fence. He never really committed himself either way. It's believed that he sat on the fence because he didn't want his new discipline of psychology being associated with anything that might be regarded as a little bit flaky. But apart from him, he's the only one that I can think of that wasn't committed to the idea of survival by the early years of the 20th century.
And obviously, this is your 4th book, as I've mentioned. Clearly, for you, this has been more than just a passing interest. So why this 4th book? Like, where are you trying to go in this book that you weren't able to explore in your 3 previous works?
The 3 previous books were all longer. They were much more detailed. All 4 of my books and several of my essays are really attacks on the skeptical fortress. I sometimes like to use the analogy: if my first 3 books were an armada, then this one is a surgical strike.
And
It's much more tightly focused.
yeah, yeah. Well, I love going down the rabbit hole, so I'm definitely excited to expand my knowledge by going to other parts of your fortress, if you will. Talk to us a little bit about the mind body relationships. I think a lot of us, if we're not immersed in the research and the literature, we just assume the mind, the spirit, consciousness, the brain, it's all one thing. Yet research and as we look at kind of what happens in the midst of a near-death experience, it seems like there's some level of separation. So in terms of what you go into in this new book, like what's the actual relationship between the mind and the brain, consciousness and the brain?
Yeah, I discussed this in the very first chapter. I think that the evidence indicates that the relationship between the mind and the brain is that the brain works as a two-way receiver transmitter for the mind, sometimes from body to mind, as in sense perception, other times from mind to body, as in willed action. And I don't even think that it's necessary to discuss or bring in the evidence of the near-death experience or the evidence of apparitions or anything like that. I think that there's solid medical reasons to believe that this is the true relationship between the mind and the brain. There was an esteemed brain surgeon named Wilder Penfield. He did work with epilepsy patients, and he won the Nobel Prize in medicine. He claims in his autobiography to have started out with the intent of trying to explain the mind in terms of the working of the brain. He gave up, completely reversed his position, and his position was that the relationship between mind and brain is that of programmer to computer. In other words, the brain, the brain is like a biological computer, which is programmed by the mind. And he gives various examples of this. We've all experienced that. We get in our car on a Saturday morning and we're thinking about something else. We find ourselves driving to work. Why? Because we programmed our brain in order to take that particular path. So, and there's also the even more striking, there's the phenomenon of terminal lucidity. You may be familiar with some of these cases. That's where someone is suffering from some form of brain disease. Could be Alzheimer's, dementia, some sort of organic damage to the brain. And in the last few days, hours of their life, they suddenly become perfectly lucid. And I mentioned a few such cases in my book. There was one case, a woman suffering from severe Alzheimer's. She had been essentially incoherent for about the last 10 years. Didn't recognize family members, things like that. And it turned out that the damage was more than psychological, it was organic. Certain parts of her brain's hippocampus had deteriorated. So she shouldn't have been able to think coherently. At any rate, during the last day or so of her life, she suddenly started speaking coherently. And she recognized friends and relatives. And her daughter said that it was like talking to someone who'd been asleep for the past 10 years and suddenly woken up. And these sorts of this phenomenon of terminal lucidity was known in ancient times. Hippocrates wrote about it, Galen, Cicero, and others. They all held the view that in the last moments of life, the mind, the spirit, whatever you want to call it, remains intact and is disengaging from the restrictions of a material brain in order to go on its way. So these things are nothing new. And as I said before, I don't even think it's necessary to bring in the NDE and other things like that, other sorts of phenomena such as that, in order to make the case that the mind and the brain are distinct and they're capable of existing, of going on separate ways and taking on separate existence.
I'd love to have you comment briefly on the out of body experience, like how, in terms of going into something that is a normal part of most near death experiences. How can that give us also some information about the mind, the spirit, if you will, operating apart from the brain?
Well, you're right that the out of body experience is commonly mentioned in the near death experience. I suppose it indicates that the mind can operate separately from the brain and can perceive the surroundings essentially, at a different perspective from the perspective we normally have, that is, within our bodies. One of the cases I mentioned, and you may be familiar with this case, is the Pam Reynolds near-death experience. Pam was a 35-year-old musician who had an aneurysm at the base of her brain. It was like a balloon that was threatening to burst. And the only way to operate on this aneurysm was to essentially, I'll be blunt, essentially to kill her on the operating table, essentially to stop her heart, stop her breathing, stop the blood flow to her brain. And she, in other words, they had to induce clinical death. She had no blood flowing to her brain, no oxygen. They were monitoring her cerebral cortex with an EEG. There was no activity at all. They were monitoring her, what is it called? Can't remember what it's called. It's a part of the brain that's yeah. Anyway, it's responsible. We share it with crocodiles and what have you. It's responsible for our autonomic system, things like digestion, breathing, what have you. And they were monitoring that too with clicks to the ears. Her pupils are fixed and dilated, indicating no activity in the brainstem. That's the word I was looking for, the brainstem. So for all intents and purposes, there's absolutely no reason, no medical reason at all to think that her brain was anything but entirely non-functioning. And yet Pam reported one of the deepest near-death experiences ever reported. She left her body and perceived the surrounding the operating theater. She reported accurately on conversations that were taking place. She remembered things that she should not have been able to perceive, such as she left her body, entered a tunnel, heard her grandmother, her departed grandmother, calling to her. And she said that she entered a misty area. And first of all, she couldn't make out. She saw people, but she couldn't make out who they were. Then gradually she was able to recognize them. It's her grandmother, a cousin, a couple that I think she'd known when she was a kid, lived next door, and so forth. And the longer she stayed talking to them, the more she wanted to remain. But her grandmother told him that she has to go return to her body. She says, "No, I don't want to." No. And but her grandmother said, "You have 2 children. Think of your children." And she said, "Oh, they'll be fine." And then it was either her uncle or her cousin, I think it was her uncle, who taught her to play guitar. He basically escorted her back to her body. She saw her body lying on the operating table. She did not want to get back in. She saw them preparing to shock her body to restart her heart. She saw them apply one shock. Her body lurched a little bit like that, as it normally does, reflex action. It didn't work. She saw them shock her body again. She shouldn't have known that it required 2 shocks to restart her heart. And at that moment, she said her uncle rather, pushed her into the body, and she simultaneously felt a pull towards the body. She said it was like jumping into a pool of ice water. She said it hurt. Next thing she remembers is waking up in the operating theater. Her physicians, her surgeons said that they couldn't explain it, but they've seen so many things they couldn't explain that they weren't going to be arrogant enough to say that it can't happen just because they can't explain it. So, in other words, they're speaking as true scientists, true physicians, medical scientists.
And let's get into some of the other evidences for survival that you cover in the book. You go a lot of different directions that people aren't necessarily going to talk about in the near-death experiences, kind of on the Christian publishing side of the fence that I work in typically. Take us into some of the other places you go in the book.
All right. Essentially, in the book, I cover 5 independent lines of evidence. Deathbed visions, the near-death experience, apparitions, children who claim to remember a previous life, and communications from the departed via human mediumship. And these are 5 independent lines of evidence, all very different from each other, and all pointing in the same direction towards reality of our survival.
Well, we won't go into all of them. We'll go into the few of them. Talk to us about deathbed visions. I mean, I feel like for a lot of us who've had a loved one who is deceased, that scenario kind of plays out. You're often in a hospital room with them. They'll start talking to people, say they're seeing departed loved ones. Sometimes they'll say they see angels or Jesus, or there's a whole range of things. Talk to us about some of the ground you cover with Deathbed Visions. I feel like that's one that's most familiar to the average person listening to or watching this.
Yeah. Um, well, you're right. I have an entire chapter on deathbed visions. Um, these have been reported also for centuries. Nothing new under the sun. And yeah, it's this in some ways they remind me of terminal lucidity, but of course they're a little bit different. It's essentially somebody who the final few days or weeks or what have you, hours of their life, they suddenly report seeing departed friends and relatives, as you say, religious figures sometimes. And some of the striking cases, I mentioned one or two of them. There's been cases in which people have not been told that a certain relative had died while they've been ill, and they weren't told because obviously their relatives didn't want to cause them any distress. But then in the final moments of their life, they report seeing their sister or their cousin, or have you. And they say, "What's he doing here?" They're genuinely puzzled. Um, yeah, there was a woman. It's another case. There was a woman in China. No, there was a woman in the United States, I believe. Chinese woman from China. She's in her 90s. She was dying of cancer, I believe. And she basically said, I'm 92 years old. I've had a good life. I'm ready to go. And she told her daughter that her husband had been calling to her. And this did not surprise her. And then one day she told her daughter that her sister was also calling to her, both of them, her husband and her sister. She said, "How can this be? My sister's alive in China." Well, it turned out that her sister had died of cancer a few days previously, and her daughter had not told her mother of her sister's death because she didn't want to upset her. But at this point, she broke down and told her mother that her sister had died in China of cancer. And she simply smiled and said, "Okay, now I understand."
I'd love to go next into apparitions or ghosts. I actually write about apparitions and ghosts in my latest book, but with my Christian worldview, like I would process what's happening in a haunted house scenario, and both of which we've experienced. I was in a haunted farmhouse for a couple years when I was pre-elementary age. But I would say that's a case of like demonic infestation, demonic activity happening for whatever reason, demons have been attracted to this locale or these people for some reason. I'm curious how you handle that in the book. Like, what do you make of ghosts or apparitions? Are they? Do you see them as like departed or lost souls who are kind of stuck in between?
It's hard to generalize. Every case is a little bit different. As you probably remember in the prologue, I deal extensively. I've got an entire section saying Christianity and the evidence for survival are compatible. So I argue that all five lines of evidence are perfectly compatible with scripture and theology. Um, with regards to whether or not hauntings are the work of um, evil spirits, demons, whatever you want to call them, miserable people. Okay. There was something that Jesus said about this, and he said, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are of God." So if we think there's no reason to suppose that change caused death suddenly turns bad people into good people, of course it's wise to test the spirits. And you also have to remember that the results of most spirit communications, most of the communicators, they urge people to be kind to each other, to love one another, to look after each other. I mean, what kind of demon goes around encouraging people to love one another?
Well, and that takes me into another question too. Um, you know, in terms of how most Christians are going to approach the idea of going to a medium to uh, talk to talk to a departed loved one, so to speak. I mean, there's biblical prohibitions. We look at the Saul and the Witch of Endor. I mean, through that after that encounter, Saul ends up dying in his battle that happens right after that. But it's really in the Old Testament, you see a lot of language around prohibiting necromancy and kind of rubbing shoulders with mediums, if you will. Yet in the near death experience space, mediums helping people connect with what they think are lost loved ones is pretty normalized in this day and age. Tell us a little bit about how you handle that in the book. And like you said, you see all 5 lines of evidence as compatible with theology and scripture. Like how do you wrestle with that in the book?
Well, okay. First, I'd like to address that story about King Saul. As I understand it, Saul contacted a medium to see how the battle would go the next day. Um, what was reported was the spirit of the prophet Samuel rose up out of the earth and told Saul that he would perish in battle the next day, which he apparently did. Um, yeah, I don't see that as, I could be wrong, but I don't see that as necessarily an injunction against it. Um, I talk about a fellow named the Reverend Charles Drayton Thomas. He was a Methodist minister and an active member of the British Society for Psychical Research. He participated in many seances with mediums. He invented a groundbreaking technique called the proxy sitting, in which, can talk about that later if you like, but it's essentially in which a third party who didn't know the departed visits the medium in order to rule out any form of telepathy or unconscious signaling between the medium and the sitter, the proxy sittings. And the success has continued just the same. Anyway, this is what Reverend Charles Thomas wrote. Perhaps it will be asked what benefit may be expected from a general acceptance of this evidence for survival. He's talking about mediumship. I think it will do for others what it has done for me. It has supplemented and reinforced my faith, both in times of bereavement and in the prospects of old age and death. Also, it has further emphasized the value of personal religion.
Yeah, and I feel like that's always going to be a big wrestle in this conversation. You know, I like even the witch of Endor or whatever the medium at Endor. She seems to be surprised that Saul's coming to her because there are laws in Israel against that. You know, they're stoning, putting people who are practicing necromancy to death. So for the king to even pursue a conversation with a medium would have been considered odd. Even she seems surprised in that circumstance. But I feel, and I think you get at this in the book. We see more specific prohibitions or cautions against that in the Old Testament. Yet I feel like with what you cover in the book, you don't feel like there's as much language against that in the New Testament, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. It's also important to remember that the evidence indicates that the early Christians, many of them practiced communication with spirits. I mean, the Christian writer Tertullian, 2nd century, I believe, he mentions this himself about how, yeah, I quote him in my book, about how some do. So, and the early, so a lot of the early Christians also accepted the idea of reincarnation. And there's nothing in the New Testament that's contrary to that. There are passages which can be interpreted as being favorable to that. You know, the story about how the disciples asked Jesus if the blind man had sinned. Why was the man blind? Did he sin? Well, why was he born blind? Did he sin? Well, if he sinned, he must have sinned in a previous life in order that he would be born blind. And Jesus did not rebuke them in his reply. Um, and yeah, as I said, yeah, Tertullian, the Christian writer, 160 to 220 Common Era. He described a woman whose gifts include, these are his words, revelation, which she experiences in the spirit by ecstatic vision amidst the sacred rites of the Lord's Day in the church. She converses with angels and sometimes even with the Lord. She both sees and hears mysterious communications. And Tertullian also argued that apparitions and what are today called near-death experiences are evidence for survival in addition to biblical writing. So it was really in the Second Council of Constantinople in the 4th century that there was a prohibition established against reincarnation. But the Pope did not call this meeting. He refused to attend. And so it's argued that it does not constitute an official injunction. It was called by the Byzantine emperor, and it's believed that he had political motivations for calling this meeting and trying to get this prohibition passed. I don't think, repeat myself, I don't think there's any necessary contradiction between the evidence I present in my book and Christian belief. Quite the contrary, actually. But I do think it is wise to heed the words, test the spirit.
Yeah, well, and I think, depending on which person you talk to, like, I would point to, uh, Jesus speaking to the thief on the cross, indicating that today you're going to be with me in paradise, or verses related to it's destined for somebody to die once, and then the judgment, in terms of, probably to push back against the ideas of reincarnation, or even it's a medium communicating, is it a demon, is it a lost spirit? But again, like as you share in the book, you're pointing to other scripture references that you feel support your point, and where you go in the book as well. And that's what I really loved about this book, is you challenge some of the things I've written in some of my books and how I tend to approach this stuff. And so for me, it was fun to go down some new rabbit holes and just see how you sharpen and challenge how I approach some of these same topics in this area. I'd love to jump next into a discussion on past life memories. Like for me, I got into the near death experience discussion just having worked with authors, telling about their experiences of heaven and hell. And then when I started reading and researching more widely, I got opened up to this whole world of past life memories. There's even some people talking about pre-life memories now. I didn't even know this space existed up until a few years ago. Talk to us a little bit about that phenomenon. I mean, what's intriguing is you have the folks out at the University of Virginia with the Department of Perceptual Studies. They've been studying, cataloging, and kind of ranking these cases for 50-ish years at this point. And so it's a very normalized and well-researched part of the space. But if you're not kind of an insider in the NDE world, you wouldn't necessarily know that there's so many like contemporary and like ancient cases of these past life memories that exist.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, you mentioned the University of Virginia. There was a psychiatrist, professor of psychiatry named Ian Stevenson, and he really started the ball rolling. I mean, these cases have been reported, as you say, thousands of years in different parts of the world, and it's a remarkably common belief. I mean, uh, Native American tribes in the Northwest, the Inuit of the Arctic, African tribes, the Australian Aborigines, the ancient Greeks, as I said earlier, many of the ancient Christians, um, and pagans and Jews accepted the idea of reincarnation. So it's an ancient belief. It was really Ian Stevenson who launched the first truly systematic study of this. He he got a grant in about, I think, the year 1960, somewhere around there, and he traveled to India and he began studying these cases. What he did was he put ads in two different Indian newspapers asking for people to come to provide him with these stories of children claimed to remember a previous life. And he was absolutely astonished by the number of responses he got. Um, he wasn't interested in the sort of I knew a guy who had a brother type of story. He was interested in the strongest cases he could find. So he wanted to find cases in which the children were still alive, they still remembered previous life, and the family had not investigated it yet. In other words, nobody had taken the kid to see to meet his previous family, or what he claims to be his previous family. So he investigated some of these cases, and some of them are very striking. Um, yeah, I mentioned several cases in the book, and I mentioned even more cases in that been my third book, I believe. Yes.
And in terms of wrestling with the idea of reincarnation as a potential afterlife destination, so to speak, do you feel like the children and past life memories is our biggest proof at this point in terms of data and research that's out there?
Um, no, I think as I said, I mentioned five independent lines of evidence. I think they're two pieces of the puzzle. Um, I think that my personal opinion is the communication via mediums, human mediums, is the single most impressive line of evidence. But they all contribute. These are five lines of evidence, very different from each other, and they all point in the same direction. Yeah. You know, with regards to, I just want to say one more thing with regards to reincarnation, because I do cover that. I know it's a sticky topic with some Christians, but there's many theologians and clergymen today who are arguing for the case. We're bringing it back into the mainstream. And there was Leslie Weatherhead. He was the former president of the British Methodist Conference. He asked in his Case for Reincarnation lecture, these are his words, "If I fail to pass those examinations in life, which can only be taken while I dwell in a physical body, shall I not have to come back and take them again?" So those who fear the prospect of endless reincarnation, their fears are groundless. The evidence, as far as I can see, and as far as others can tell, indicates that most of us only come back 2 or 3 times. I mean, once the lessons of Earth life are learned, there's simply no reason to repeat them.
And in terms of the past life memories, like uh I wonder, like in terms of the like Ian Stevenson's research, I feel like a large percentage of their research was done outside of the Western world, where kind of the faith ideas in those cultures tend to be more supportive of reincarnation. Do you? I'm just curious in terms of you're looking into that area. Do you think that's kind of a blind spot in their research, or I mean, maybe that's just where they found cases to study? I mean, you see it somewhat here in the Western world, but I feel like it's prevalent in India and other places, and not as much, say, here in the States or Europe. Or maybe I'm just not aware of those cases.
Well, Stevenson began his research in India. He also gathered cases from other parts of the Far East. Here in the West, we tend to associate belief in reincarnation with the cultures of the Far East. But as I said before, reincarnation is an ancient belief which is found in an astonishingly wide variety of cultures around the world. I mean, Africa, Australian Aborigines, the Vikings, the ancient Celts, and so on. I mean, you get out, these places are so far apart and so remote from each other, it's difficult to understand how this belief could have arisen in different parts of the world without children reporting these previous lives independently of other cultures. To be fair, Stevenson has gathered cases from the United States, Europe, England. There was one particularly striking case. There were these 2 little girls in England, and they were struck by an automobile and killed. Parents were understandably devastated. A few years later, the mother had a dream that both girls were going to come back as twins. And her physician told her, no, you're only carrying one child. Much to her surprise, she did give birth to 2 little girls, and they shared many characteristics with the previous children. And yeah, there were others. There were other signs and evidence as well that they really did come back. What happens is these children, once they typically start discussing these previous lives when they're around 2, 3 years old, and they begin to talk. By the time they get to be 6, 7, 8 years old, the memories fade. By the time they're 9 and 10, the memories are usually completely gone. So that's why Ian Stevenson wanted to basically interview children whose parents had not taken them to visit the previous family.
And I think the last place I'd love to go before we wrap up, under kind of alternative explanations, like, people will say, well, these experiences are caused by oxygen deprivation. I feel like that's been discussed widely in lots of places, but yours was the first book I'd encountered people saying, like, clairvoyance, ESP, like that's an alternative explanation. That was brand new to me in your book, just based on, and I'm pretty widely read in this space. And it sounds like you like wrestle with this and battle against this in your previous works as well. So take us into that briefly, because it's a significant part of this work.
Okay. How much time do we have, Shaun?
Hey, up to 25 minutes if you need it.
Oh, okay. All right. The reason I asked is because I'd like to first address something you just mentioned, which was oxygen deprivation as an explanation. That's been completely ruled out. That was very common a few years ago. But the simple fact of the matter is that the effects of oxygen deprivation, either reduction or complete elimination, they're very well known. I mean, mountain climbers have experienced it. Pilots flying at high altitude have experienced it. And not many people realize this. But years ago, it was common for medical students to undergo oxygen deprivation. what they would do is they'd have them breathe in and out of a spirometer with a carbon dioxide filter attached to it. The reason for the carbon dioxide filter was to prevent the CO2 from building up in their blood and giving them the feeling they were suffocating. So they were slowly suffocating, but they didn't know it because the CO2 was not building up in their blood. What they'd have them do is they'd have them perform some simple task like, I don't know, solving arithmetic problems, what have you. And every time, what would happen is their performance at this task would become increasingly inept. Then they just pass out. But my point really is that in thousands of such experiments on thousands of students, no one, not a single person, ever reported a near-death experience. So we can rule out oxygen deprivation completely. So what does that leave? Well, and some of these the most common counter explanation these days is the so-called super ESP counter explanation, or super psi. The reason why, and that's essentially the idea that the medium is employing vast, virtually unlimited, almost omniscient powers of extrasensory perception in order to gather information from all sorts of places, from people's minds, regardless of what they're thinking of, even if they're strangers, from books and articles and newspapers, regardless of where they may be located, then instantly collating this information and then employing a subconscious deception. So in other words, you've got to also bring in unconscious deception of the medium, or medium's unconscious mind is employing deception. In other words, the medium's unconscious mind is a brilliant con artist, is fooling everybody, including the medium's conscious mind. Now, the reason they have to come up with such a ridiculous and far-fetched explanation is because they haven't got anything else. They've run out of oxygen deprivation doesn't work. Fraud has been ruled out conclusively, beyond all reasonable doubt. Mistaken eyewitness testimony has been ruled out, and I rule all these things out in my book. I go through all the different counter explanations. Only one pseudo-explanation or counter-explanation remains in the field, and that's super ESP or super psi, or sometimes they call it living agent ESP. It's ruled out on a number of grounds. First of all, it most certainly is super extrasensory perception. Some of them, proponents like to call it living agent extrasensory perception or living agent psi in order to try and soften it. But it really is super because it vastly exceeds. It requires a level of extrasensory perception vastly exceeding anything found in the experimental or the anecdotal literature. Most forms of ESP in real life, they involve a sense of being stared at, or a feeling of danger, or the phone rings and you think, I think that's my aunt. Not, gathering information from anywhere in the world instantly from sources, even if the medium doesn't know these sources even exist. But I'm making an even stronger charge against super ESP, and that's that no magnitude of extrasensory perception, or psychokinesis for that matter, moving objects, can possibly account for the strongest aspects of some of these cases. I mentioned cases of mediumship, many of these cases gathered by the British and American Society of Psychical Research, in which you have a personality coming through, conversing with living friends and relatives in detail, to the point where these living friends and relatives are utterly convinced that they're having a conversation with their old friend or their old relative. I mentioned several such cases. There was a George Pelham case. They brought in, I think it was 130 sitters to visit the medium, Lenore Piper, and converse with George Pelham. Of these 130 sitters, 30 of them had known the living George Pelham in real life. And George recognized 29 out of 30 of them. There was never a case of false recognition. He never claimed to know somebody that he didn't know in life. All 30 of the sitters were absolutely convinced they were conversing with their old friend or their old relative. There was one case in which he did not recognize the sitter, and that was a young woman of about 18 or 19 years old. last time Pelham had seen her, she had been about 8 or 9 years old. He didn't immediately recognize her because she'd been a little girl. She changed a great deal. He finally figured out who she was. Now, under Super ESP, he should have recognized her because she knew, the young woman knew that George had known her when alive, and also Richard Hodgson, the skeptical attorney and researcher who researched the case, he was there on the scene, and he knew that the living Pelham had known this little girl when she was alive. So sources for telepathy were at hand, and yet he failed to recognize her. I mentioned other cases in which the medium displays temporarily and instantly acquires high-level skills that require the departed person years of practice to acquire. Playing chess, discussing classical philosophy, speaking foreign languages. So no magnitude of extrasensory perception or psychokinesis for that matter can possibly explain the instant acquisition, the convincing impersonation of people that the medium never met or barely met, or even more remarkably, the instant and temporary acquisition of high-level skills required the departed person years of practice to acquire. And I don't even stop there. I also talk about mental characteristics distinctive of the departed. The difference between extrasensory perception and the cases I present is that the active participation of the departed person's mind appears to be required. There's no way around that. Not merely gathering information about the deceased. So to make a long story short, to answer your question, I think Super ESP as an explanation completely falls apart. That was one of the, I suppose, the central tasks of my book in order to discredit these counter explanations, and especially the only remaining one that's left, which is Super ESP.
Well, and I think in general, when we start to look at, the past life memories and mediumship and other things, like there are a lot of big spiritual challenges to wrestle with depending on what worldview lens we're trying to decipher and understand this through. Like for me, trying to come at it through my worldview lens, I would push back in a mediumship circumstance and say that, my understanding is it may be a familiar spirit who's impersonating the deceased person, because in my estimation, there's no reason that soul should be trapped in between, say, Earth and the afterlife. And I know you push back against that early in the book. Like, in your view, am I trying to come at this with too simplistic of a lens, or do you feel like I'm maybe being afraid of like the wider body of like some of what you just shared? Because like again, that's just how I approach it with my worldview and my faith and how I understand it. But you're coming at it from a different direction. So if that was my response to you, I'd love to just hear how would you push back on me?
Okay, well, I guess I'd like to say that, again, in my prologue, I argue very strongly against that. And I mentioned how the British and American Society of Psychical Research, both founded in the 1880s when people were more conservative in their beliefs than they tend to be today, they included many clergymen and theologians. Most of the early members of the British and American Societies for Psychical Research were, in fact, practicing Christians. Some were Catholics, some were Anglicans, some were Methodists, what have you. And some of them had the difficulties that you expressed. But all the ones that I'm aware of eventually came around and argued that the evidence that they have gathered from mediumship, from apparitions, what have you, is fully compatible with the Christian faith, and it supplements and reinforces their belief. And not only that, I think it's also important to remember that in the latter part of my book, I have a chapter, my very last chapter is What the Dead Say, very last appendix, I should say. And several of the messages that come through, they praise Jesus of Nazareth, they quote the apostles, and yet they reaffirm some of the points that I make earlier in the book. So I don't think there's any necessary incompatibility between the sort of evidence that I discuss and Christian belief.
Yeah, and I think big picture, as we look at the different lines of evidence you present in the book, like I'm in agreement that there is a continuation of consciousness, mind, soul in the afterlife. I think a lot of it comes down to our particular worldview lens and our bent that we're going to try to process it and make sense of it. And that's the fun of writing books like this. You get to wrestle with this sort of stuff and share it with a wider audience. Um, in terms of uh, like the belief in life after death, continuation of consciousness, whether we're going to give it, try to say, well, through science, the physical body, this is what's going on, or, more of a spiritual or paranormal kind of explanation, whether we go one direction or other, is it all in the end a matter of faith with what we're kind of the framework we're choosing to understand this through?
I don't think so. I think that the evidence supplements our faith and reinforces it. I don't think that people such as ourselves who accept the reality of survival need to make excuses for our belief or even to take refuge in mysteries of faith. The evidence is on our side, and as I point out in my book, it comes from 5 independent lines of evidence, which all point in the same direction.
And Chris, in terms of like the reader's journey with the book, they get to that last page. Like, is there a thread, a takeaway? Like, you're like, man, I hope every single reader gets this from the time they spent in these pages.
Well, I hope they become like me, convinced that the case for the afterlife has in fact been proven beyond all reasonable doubt.
And Chris, in terms of people connecting with you and finding out about this and your previous works in the NDE space, like where can we discover you and your work on the web?
Well, probably the best place for the interested person to go would be the Llewellyn website. That's my publisher, Llewelyn, Llewellyn Publishing. And on the site, I'll provide the link for you later on. On the site, they can find a description of my book. They can find endorsements. And my publisher also asked me to write a brief essay summarizing some of my major ideas. They can read that too, see how much they like it, and get an idea for my style of writing.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. I'll have links in the description and the show notes to Chris's page on the Llewellyn website, as well as a link to that essay. So if you'd like to read that, we'll have that linked up there for you. And I can say, Chris, man, I totally love my journey with your book. You and I come at some of this through different like angles and lenses, but you challenged me, you sharpened me, you took me to new areas of research that I've not even begun to go down those rabbit holes. So for me, a very enjoyable journey with your book. Sadly, it's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation today with Chris Carter. Once again, our book today is The Case for the Afterlife, Evidence for Life After Death. And Chris, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks again, Shaun.